Hi, everyone. My name is Jay Rajaraman, and I supervise the Family Representation Project at Legal Services of New Jersey. I am moderating an incredible panel today. I'm really excited to have these women with me. I have Dr. Johnson, Dr. Eskelin, and Aisha, our parent ally at Legal Services of New Jersey. And in spirit of this conference, we are taking on mental health and racism in the child welfare system. So we welcome questions and comments in the chat. I always like to say we do have a parent ally here, Aisha, who's been the first parent ally in New Jersey. I'm really fortunate to have her here. But it's safe space, meaning that be sensitive to the comments and encourage and be supportive. I just want to note that as she shares parts of her story. And luckily she has her children returned to her, but it was 5 years of a battle, and all of us in this conference know what that's like. So I just want to make that comment. And I'm also sharing a PowerPoint, but it's not going to be a slide PowerPoint. It's going to be a guide for conversation. You will have this in your materials. So please feel free to follow along. Like I said, it's not really meant for reading, but just to guide the doctors and Aisha points that they want to hit on. And what we hope to accomplish today is actually taking on and understanding mental health. And as we know how critical it is as it impacts families in the child welfare system, we know it often makes and breaks a case and ends up removing children, preventing supervised visitation or unsupervised, delaying reunification, and ultimately termination. And you'll hear from two experts in the field who have done evaluations for all three, child's attorney, parent's attorney, and the agency's perspectives. And again, you'll hear firsthand from Aisha for her experiences between treatment and forensic. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so I'll start here. What, Dr. Eskin and Dr. Johnson, if you can speak on what are the roles of mental health professionals generally in the system? And I'll start with you, Dr. E. You're muted still. And if you guys want to take off your mutes,
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. I just wanted to make the distinction between the role of a mental health provider who is treating a client and the role of an evaluator who's making recommendations to the court, essentially. This is a distinction that has been made by the mental health fields for about the last 20 years, and it's related to the notion that, correct or incorrect, that it's difficult to be objective if you are a treatment provider. And so the idea is that when people are hired to do evaluations, they're hired really to serve the court. And when they're hired as treatment providers, they're supposed to be hired really to work with the clients and ally themselves with the client, and that it's very hard to conduct both of those roles. In New Jersey, that has actually been written into our rules and regulations for psychologists and social workers and counselors, and it emanated originally from divorce cases, but it's been extended to these kinds of cases as well. Right, and this is a slide that really talks about the distinction as it's been made between these two roles in an original article in 1997 and now in New Jersey administrative law.
Right. And Dr. Eskelin, as we talk about consent, if you can briefly, both of you, but I think you said, and we've had conversations about this, even stepping back, when you think about going to a therapist or a mental health specialist, you've described how, say, if today I needed therapy and I was looking for a therapist, I'm volunteering, like thinking about it. I'm finding a doctor in my neighborhood on my medical insurance. I'm pursuing it voluntarily. What's the difference here? And if you can hit, both of you doctors, hit on consent and why this is really unique to the child welfare system.
I'll jump in, and then Dr. Johnson might want to add. Again, I'm speaking in terms of my experience in New Jersey. In New Jersey, when there are parents involved with the system, if they have resources, which is not typical, but if they have resources and or insurance, they are sometimes, and maybe even often, allowed to go to their own chosen practitioner. But most of our clients do not have those resources. And so our agency steps up and offers services. But these services are contracted services with agencies, mental health agencies. And in those contracts, the identified client is the agency, the child welfare agency or the child destruction agency or whatever you want to call it, that agency and is is the client, and therefore the contract says that the file on the client, the therapeutic file, belongs to the agency, that is the child welfare agency, not the parent. The parent cannot release information to his or her own attorney or to anybody else. And that actually, it seems to me to be seriously problematic. And I know Dorothy Roberts just talked about this in her talk, because it really takes away the autonomy of the client with regard to their own treatment, and it subjugates them to being to everything they're saying in what usually is a confidential encounter being open to really disclosure to the court, to all the parties involved. To me, it undermines the effectiveness of therapy. Clients would have a very difficult time, I believe, trusting clinicians if they knew about it. And they're supposed to know about it, but I think that doesn't always happen.
Dr. Johnson, did you want to chime in there?
No, I don't have anything to add. I'm going to wait for my section when it comes up.
Got it. Great. I'm going to call on Aisha. If you want to unmute yourself, Aisha. If you can talk about what therapies you did, what the agency ordered you or the court ordered you to do, and just first give some background as to what you were asked to do, the long list of things.
Okay. So initially, I had just agreed to do whatever they asked me to do at the meeting, just so I could get my children back. And then since I agreed, once we got to court, it became like a court's order that I had to complete all of these things. So I had to do DV counseling. I had to move to a shelter for battered women in an undisclosed location. I had to do individual therapy. I had to do anger management. I had to do parenting classes. I had to do family therapy. And I also had to do therapy with just my daughter. So, and I had, the bridge program that I had to attend. So they just were telling me that, I needed these services, and I agreed. And it just, like I said, became a court's order to complete.
And Aisha, if it's okay to share, the reason your kids were taken was because of DV caused to you, and you were arrested for just one night, and it took 5 years to get your kids. So what did you think about being ordered to do parenting, DV, anger, when it's directed at you? Like, just, were you ever heard about these things? Did anyone ask for your input?
I'm sorry, it kind of went out like towards the end, but yeah, I'm sorry.
No. Did anyone ask for your input, like what you wanted for therapies? Did the court care to listen to what you had to say?
No, like I said, they would just I didn't even get to speak for myself at all, because they told me I had an open case, that I was arrested, and I shouldn't speak. So my public defender, she really did all of the talking, and she just told me, you need to be evaluated, you need to go to therapy, you need to do this, you have to do this before the next court date, or you're not going to get your kids back.
Did you know what you were telling the therapist, like your DV counselor was going to go back to the court? And if you did, feel comfortable talking to your counselor?
No, I didn't know that, the information that I was sharing with them, how they were utilizing it against me. So I probably wouldn't have given them a lot of the information that I did. You don't really feel like you can trust them. you know. So it's like I had these therapy sessions for months, like 6 months at a time. So once, because I would have court like every 3 months, so once I would find out what was going on, it just would make me disconnect more, you know. So it's just like, everything that I was telling them was being used against me. So it just was hard to be honest. It was hard to like get the help that I really wanted or needed, because I was scared to tell them because they would use it against me.
That's so powerful, Aisha. Just to pull the doctors in, I mean, is that effective therapy? Aisha didn't know it was going to be pulled in. It was being used. What's your thoughts on that?
I guess I'll just add and say that, typically the therapist is supposed to tell the client what they will be talking about and how they're going to use the information, because that's supposed to be part of the informed consent. But I do agree, though, that it doesn't happen very often that the clients understand that, or the clients may be upset about having to come into therapy, and so maybe the therapist may have glossed over it, but didn't explain it sufficiently, until the client actually understood. But, it's just terrible to hear that happened to her, and it's not uncommon at all, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's certainly an ethical violation not to inform a client that is kind of part of the procedure that the therapist is following. But the other aspect of it is, even if the client is told, I think you have really a double standard here, where people who have resources can argue and often do get to go to their own therapist. And then those therapists treat the client as being the person in charge of their own record. So if a client has Medicaid or a client has private insurance and they go to their own therapist, the agency does not have access to those records. The client has to allow each time for that record to be sent. And so you have really a very different thing going on for people who have resources and people who don't.
That's a great poverty point to stress. And also, I know we're going to get into racism about Black and Brown communities and their relationship with medical professionals as well. But as a family defense attorney, I spend a lot of time, I was not Aisha's attorney, with my clients, prepping them for these therapeutic sessions, knowing that it'll be used and literally used against them in court. And so they're not benefiting. It's not real therapy, right? Because I'm telling someone like Aisha, be careful what you're saying, because it'll be used to keep your child away from you. And often when we close our cases, we get them another therapist that's their own, and the division, the agency is not aware. Because people do benefit from therapy, just not what's court ordered in these cases.
I just want to add another thought. If you're telling them to be careful what they say, and they are careful about what they say, they will appear guarded and non-compliant to the therapist. And then that has consequences as well. So I don't think there's no out in this situation if you end up in seeing a contracted therapist.
Absolutely, it's absolutely right. It's so artificial. I think after 20 years of doing this, I can tell you which therapists have trigger phrases or comments that you're literally tweaking so they can get through that parenting class in DV. It's horrible. It's horrible. And Aisha is now, as a parent ally, we'll ask Aisha to prep a client or support a client. Aisha, if you want to speak on that, she knows what a parent has to say. Sadly, because she went through it. Aisha, feel free to chime in and into power dynamics. Go ahead, Aisha.
Yeah, I do kind of inform my clients now to be careful of what you say. Like, like a lot of single women, parents will say, like, I like to have a glass of wine at night to, kind of wind down my day and just be comfortable. But if you say that to a therapist, then you look like you have a drinking problem, drinking wine every day. So you can't really, say a lot of things, to these therapists. They don't inform you properly of how they're going to be using the information. And when I did kind of seem guarded, it would come out in court, like, she's basically putting on a front, and like she doesn't have, she has a problem admitting like she has a problem. So, it's just, it didn't really work that way. Either way, it's like a double-edged sword.
And
Exactly.
let me just also add to that. I think a lot of clients don't know the difference in the roles between the mental health evaluator, the psychological evaluator, and the counselor as well. So, that's another dynamic in relation to that's often problematic.
So leading with the doctors, can you talk about power dynamics?
Sure. I'd love to. Typically when Child Protective Service clients come to see a mental health professional, there are differences between the two in race, culture, economic status, and education. And these differences in political status and social status typically leave the Child Protective Service client in a relatively powerless position in relation to the mental health professional. Now, Black clients sense the power differential, and they usually respond with protective behaviors that are then erroneously conceptualized as pathological by the mental health professionals. So those are the main issues for me. Anytime you have a client coming into a situation where they are powerless, there is going to be a natural protective response that an African American is going to then demonstrate, because we've been in many, many situations before where we've had to protect ourselves. But unfortunately, within the context of a mental health evaluation, as you have said, my attempt to protect myself is going to be seen as pathological, resistant, non-compliant, without people understanding, well, maybe she's acting this way because she's afraid. And so, maybe if you address the fear, or maybe if you relate to her differently, maybe she'll be able to respond differently in terms of that interaction.
Great. That's incredibly helpful. I mean, our first few slides, first part of the section, sort of build a foundation of understanding for this audience, because I think and Dr. Esplin has said this many times, it's like the mental health track is on its own track and the legal community is somewhere else, very separate, and there's no conversation. And so to understand what Black and poor communities experience and how that's interpreted by the mental health providers and what's reported out to the courts is so different than what is understood. And one of the things, and I'm just following the chat, this comes up about release and sort of protecting the information, but I think it has to go deeper than that, and where the mental health providers who are involved need to understand this much more essentially. Dr. E, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I just want to comment in general about the whole involvement of mental health people tends to bring in people on one side or the other. And that becomes, so if people's entire livelihoods and their professional lives are wound up with working for the agency, even though they're independent practitioners, it becomes very hard for them to see the world from a different perspective. As I sat and listened to Marty Guggenheim and Dorothy Roberts today, I'm thinking about my colleagues and how much they need to hear this conversation. My colleagues who typically testify for the division, because I don't think there's any sense of the larger sociocultural issue that's going on. They're very focused in on this person and this family as though there's no context. So.
Exactly. Aisha, did you ever feel like you trusted your therapist? And if not, why? And did any of your therapists reflect your community as a single Black woman?
I didn't feel like I trusted my therapist at all. I've never had a Black female therapist or anybody that looked like me. So, just looking at my therapist, and just I could just remember their faces. Just the smile was just not even genuine. You know, I just knew that they were really just a way to pry into my life because I won't talk directly to DCPP. So it's just a way of them being sneaky.
It's really powerful, and that's not unique or unusual. Okay, let's talk about expertise and what makes a professional cultural expert.
Great, great. You know, the general issue with this is that just because you are a licensed mental health professional, that does not necessarily mean that you are an expert in the culture of the client. You know, the main problem with psychological treatment and services is that mental health services are based upon the values, belief system, behavior, research, and procedures of the dominant culture, and they're not based upon the values, belief system, behavior, experiences, and strengths of people of color. You know, the literature consistently shows us that Black people are overdiagnosed, over-medicated, and receive a poor quality of treatment in comparison to white populations. And, you know, this is also true in relation to our Child Protective Service clients because the clinicians and the evaluators do not understand culture. I believe they make many more recommendations for clients than are necessary, and I believe that they diagnose them with more pathological mental health issues than perhaps is warranted as well. The other thing that I wanted to say is that usually you can see this issue with cultural competence in Child Protective Service cases revolve around the issue of child discipline and non-abusive corporal punishment. You know, that's a big issue for Child Protective Services. Typically, the system does not understand that African Americans typically value a stricter discipline and stricter obedience than the dominant culture. And the system doesn't understand that Black people endorse stricter discipline because it helps protect the children from the dangers of the street, and it helps protect the children from interactions with the dominant culture. So whereas the system sees strict discipline and strict obedience as being punitive and harsh, I'm going to say from an African American perspective, we see it as protective and as one of the ways that we're trying to make sure our children stay out of trouble. Another issue that is often seen is who is considered family. You know, the system quite often considers a nuclear family. That's their concept of family. But I'm going to tell you in the African American family, there are people that we consider family who may not be blood related. So then if you're looking at a case plan and they'll say in the case plan, oh, well, this person has no family, the first thing I always ask to myself is, well, did they look for other important people in the community that may be important that the client and the children may consider family, but they may not be blood family? That's just as important to us as blood kin is. And then the last thing that often is a problem is a lot of times in African American families, we expect children to assume responsibility very early. And that typically is not how it's done in dominant culture families. So then a lot of times you'll see mental health people erroneously call African American children parentified, okay, which is considered a bad thing from a mental health perspective. But I'm going to say from a cultural perspective, if I have two parents that are working 2 or 3 jobs, as a child, I'm going to be called upon to help out with my siblings. I'm going to be called upon to clean and cook and do different things. And so a lot of times mental health people do not understand that that kind of responsibility for children is expected and necessary for the family's survival. And so then I guess the last thing that I want to say about cultural expertise, you know, cultural expertise for the mental health professional is more likely to be seen, not based on their academic level, but based on how much does the mental health professional have supervision in cultural issues? How well read is the mental health professional in terms of cultural issues? How many cultural organizations does the mental health professional belong to? So we're looking to see how well the mental health professional understands, participates, and has had supervision in cultural issues beyond them just being licensed.
So I think, Dr. Johnson, that was incredibly helpful, because as an attorney, I need to be able to merge those two issues, right? I am cross-examining a doctor or having my expert speak, and to explain how relevant and valuable that is to understand the cultural competency and expertise for that family can demonstrate that there might not be a mental health issue, or to understand that this person's able to parent. And so that a concept is very common with Black and Brown communities of having extended family. So for years, I thought every auntie and uncle were related to me. There was no difference, right? That's not unusual for so many families. Having large families in a 1-bedroom home is no different from the way I grew up, right? And the way you respect your elders and responsibilities, it didn't mean you were any less safe, you weren't any in danger, your parents were not abusing you or using you as a workhorse. Like, these are very Western, rich, white, upper middle concepts. And that gets lost in court, that gets lost in judges. So any recommendations had to just get that information, because there's such a leaning, especially in New Jersey, and I know New Jersey, I mean, literally, as you both know, and Aisha knows, most decisions will require some medical input, whether to remove, is the visitation unsafe? Is this parent able to have more time? Like, everything is being supported by medical experts, and medical experts that don't have what Dr. Johnson just described. So any tips for advocates here on how information, either in court or in any discussion?
Well, my thought is that I have observed that most of the time the attorneys do not ask the opposing doctor enough questions around cultural competence. They will just accept their credentials as being licensed in the state, but they won't ask them questions. What coursework have you had in working with African American families? How much supervision have you had in working with African American families? What do you know about how African American family life is different than dominant culture? What do you know about how mental health issues are different in African American families? So I don't think that the attorneys ask the experts enough questions to see what they know culturally. We just accept it because they're licensed. Because the reality is, if my expert can answer those questions, if my expert has been supervised for 20 years in reference to culture, or they belong to the Association of Black Psychologists for 20 years, if your expert has taught people about cultural differences in mental health treatment, or has written articles or chapters about differences in mental health, then clearly they are more of a cultural expert than perhaps another doctor who has not had that experience. And then to me, the doctor that doesn't have experience, every one of his conclusions or recommendations, he needs to be able to justify from a cultural lens. And if he cannot do that in the courtroom, then I'm going to consider his testimony not as adequate as a doctor that does have that experience and can speak from a learning knowledge as well as just being licensed as a psychologist.
It's really
I would just add one quick thing, and that is, I would be interested in the commitment of the psychologist to understand. I mean, I think what I'm about to say underlies what a lot of things that Dr. Johnson just said. What is the commitment of this person to multiculturalism? And I don't know whether the court would allow, but I think it's relevant to ask questions about where people live, where they go to church, whether they have friends who are people of color, whether they have family members who are people of color. I mean, because we live in such a continuing segregated society in people's personal lives. And so, then this other becomes an object to be analyzed rather than a human being. And I think it's this kind of attitudinal thing. I'm not sure the best way to get under it, but I think it is really important.
just want to pull Aisha back into our conversation. The other thing that we're hitting on is, as we're talking about Black and Brown communities and some of what's imposed, the stereotypes that are imposed about the community that's actually equated to a mental health concern, right? In Aisha's case, if you wanted to share and your thoughts of how you had to convince the court that being a single Black woman, there was an assumption that you would always pick the wrong man, and how that became a constant issue. Aisha, do you want to speak on that?
Oh, so yes, they basically, just made me look like I just made bad decisions. I keep making bad decisions. Like I can't make good decisions. Can you say the question again?
Sure.
I want to make sure I answer it.
Yeah, and I know we're having the delay. I see it on my end quite a bit. What was also required, not only as being someone of struggling, living in poverty, but being a single Black woman, there were additional requirements on you. They wanted to show that you would not always go back to a domestic violent relationship, or you and I talked about how they assumed you would have different partners. Like there was a lot of sexism in your case.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to bring this as another example that, really delayed reunification in your case.
Yes. Like I said, they just would make it seem like I made bad decisions. Like all the information that I gave the therapist, if I continued to be in the relationship with my boyfriend after the abuse, they basically didn't want me near my children because it was like endangering them. So I just, it's kind of hard to answer that question, really.
No, you're doing it. That's perfect. You're just describing what attorneys often feel. The term is failure to protect, are not able to see or learn from the reason you got involved in the system. But it's really absolutely sexist and incredible that that's what's assumed. I often get with my clients, who are the fathers, like assuming there's more than one father, like, that's their start off question from a doctor, right? Yeah. I mean, where do you go from there if that's where the doctor is assuming, where part of town you're from? These are things that for me are absolutely red flags, and they're not going to be therapeutically helpful, and they're only going to continue the barriers that you need, and it's, actually strengthen them in court.
And let me just add, unfortunately, mental health professionals make diagnoses and recommendations based upon their worldview regarding what they think is normal and what is not. So if you have no experience being a single Black woman, if you've lived with one person, or you've been married for 20 years, you're not going to have an understanding of a single Black woman that may have more than one partner. And, we make our value judgments, unfortunately, based on what we know, rather than from the perspective of the client's culture. And it has a devastating impact on Black clients, not only in the Child Protective Service Plan, but especially in court.
I just want to add, then we're going to go from our therapeutic to psychological testing, which is the other place of devastation for our families. But a comment that has come up, and Aisha and I are working with several clients now, especially a dad, where going to your point, Dr. Johnson, when Black and Brown parents challenge or question diagnoses of their children or over medication or therapies, they're deemed to failure to understand, failure to meet their needs, failure to thrive. And I just want to point out
Let me add medical neglect.
Medical neglect, right? What is that? What you can't, and then, you go watch the rest of the world talking about I can give birth in my bathtub at home, and I have a right to breastfeed and skin to skin. It's like this, except these concepts don't apply to my clients. My clients are not allowed to breastfeed and give birth, and have not, all of a sudden the attachment bonding, all the medical judgment and support doesn't exist for the families I serve. You have to follow this protocol. And I just thoughts on that, like how do we, because often when I say these comments about how important breastfeeding is and skin to skin is, it's like eye rolling. Judges roll their eyes at me, like, because I already have a client that doesn't deserve their child, and I'm talking about something so fringe, so not critical. Or if I talk about my dad who's questioning the medication dosage and wants to do more activities with him, he looks like he's misunderstanding. He's not as educated, right? I mean, thoughts about that can guide us as advocates in these issues would be great.
I'm just going to say, unfortunately, you're going to need to have an expert, right, to render that opinion most of the time.
And I do want to say that about a lot of these issues, but I'll just talk specifically about the issue of medication, psychotropic medication. There's a huge amount of controversy in the field about that. And there's a lot of criticism within the mental health field, apart from the whole, child welfare system, about whether kids are being medicated too much, whether certain medications have been promulgated for financial benefit of pharmaceutical companies and individual scholars. So there's and many of the kids in child welfare, this is a whole other topic, but I just want to mention it, really because of their histories of being separated in the attachment disruption and whatever other chaos have existed in their lives, have traumatic lives, and their behaviors are a response to those traumas, not necessarily something that can be easily or properly addressed by medication. So when a parent says, I don't think medication is what my kid needs, there's a lot of basis on which to say that. And there's a lot of understanding in the larger field about this.
Can I, if I may just interject, as my cousin, she's actually going through this. Her second child, she has 6 children. Her second child has autism, and he's in school, and the medication that they were giving him wasn't working. And so they wanted to give him something stronger. And my cousin refused and decided to keep him home and send him to school, because without that he can't go to school without that medication because he's a problem there. She decided to not give him the medication and to keep him home because she didn't want to, keep medicating her son. But that was considered medical neglect, because she has no problem, taking care of him. Saying like she can work with him. Other people can't. You understand? It's like other people can't control him. So he doesn't need medication when he's at home. He doesn't need that. Like, as long as he's with her, he listens. So, it's really unfair that she has to go through that because they can't control him or other people can't control him, and they feel like he's, under medication. But like I said, it's not fair. She's going through a lot because of that. And, everybody doesn't need medication, even though they're diagnosed. So,
and let me just, to support what she's saying, the other question for me often is, if it was a white mother, a white upper middle class mother who had an autistic child, and she told the school that she didn't want to give her son medication, the school would be less likely to call DIFUS on her and to dare say that she's being neglectful medically. But because our clients are powerless, which goes back to the power differential, people feel that they know better. People presume that the clients aren't doing the right thing, or that the clients are doing it from a bad place or an uneducated, and then the judgment is made. And then unfortunately, the client's going to have to follow whatever protocol the state comes up with, unless you can find an expert that can testify or say something different.
I think just to note, and this has come up through the chat and a question, even if you can't find an expert, your suggestion, Dr. Johnson, of crossing their expert or who's ever reporting on the lack of cultural competency checking their own bias, understanding that the testing, and this is Dr. Esklin is well aware, I want their data points. I want to know what's in their background to make sure when they're relying on their testing, which kind of goes right into our psychological testing, how much work they've done to ensure that they're reporting out, understanding these points. And I've had many doctors just like generally surprised that I'm asking this, that I'm concerned with this, or why is this relevant? So, but having those expressions of shock, or like this has nothing to do with medical neglect or safety decision-making, is really helpful to an advocate to connect the dots when you're closing or trying to put your premise forward to a judge. Okay, so let's go into racial issues into psychological testing, and I'll start with the doctors on that. Feel free.
So there's a lot that I could say here, and I know we're very limited for time. I want to say, first of all, that there is a long established history of concerns about the use of standardized testing and how it's been used in various oppressive ways. This goes back at least to the period of 1921 and 24, when immigration restrictions were enacted by the federal government. And part of that decision was based on testimony by well-known psychologists at the time about the lack of intellectual capacity of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of whom were barely fluent in English when they were tested. So we're talking about white folks who at that time were kind of quasi people of color. And this has gone on to have to impact how children are placed in school, the overrepresentation of children of color, particularly Black children, in categories of intellectual inability, et cetera. And it also impacts personality testing. So I want to say that there's a long history of recognition and yet continued use, the recognition of the problems of testing and continued use. And it is ironic to me that in the last year, since the George Floyd murder, suddenly the testing companies, for the first time, really, and I finished graduate school in 1971. In all the years of my practice, I've never seen testing companies suddenly be offering seminars and webinars on equity in testing. I've never seen that. And all of a sudden, these companies for whom this has been big business have been offering these webinars because they're aware that people are kind of really angry about this. As a general thing, what I want to say is that the problem with testing is twofold. One is inherent in the tests, because the tests themselves have to be standardized, and there's a normative population with whom any test taker is being compared. And that normative population, number one, often doesn't have certain groups of people. For example, there's virtually no immigrants in those normative populations. Secondly, they typically don't have significant or enough numbers of people of color in those normative populations. And when there are, there's no attempt to really look at whether there are differences between how, let's say, Black people do and white people do, because they do look at whether there are differences between how boys or men do versus girls or women. And when they find those differences, they statistically fix it so that you don't come up with different scores based on whether you're male or female. But for Black people and white people, even when there are clear differences, the norms are not adapted to reflect that problem, so that the Black client is being assessed according to essentially norms that are based on the predominant white population. And so this it's not just intellectual testing, it's also personality testing, issues around paranoia, for example, where Black people are more likely to report or endorse symptoms of paranoia is taken as a symptom of psychopathology rather than a natural response or an adaptive response to a hostile environment. So this problem it goes across both personality and cognitive assessment. But the other big issue around testing has to do with the context in which people are tested. So the general notion about psychological evaluations, whether it's testing or interviewing, is that somehow you as the psychologist are capturing a sample of behavior that is representative of this person in general. Now, we've talked so far about how stressed and prepared to be defensive clients are in this testing and evaluation situation. That is not a sample of their behavior with their friends, of their behavior with their children, right? That's a sample of how they act when they are stressed and fearful and feel powerless. And so then the question is, how do you take this behavior, whether it's testing behavior or what they say on interview, or even what you observe them doing with their children, how do you take that and generalize it to the rest of their lives? And that is the place I think that we really, as psychologists, get very messed up. We don't see the impact of us on this client. We kind of act as though we're a blank screen that the client sees as just a window, not a human being. And then the client reacts kind of out of their own psychological functioning, not in a context. So I think these two issues, the way the tests are constructed, as well as the failure to really recognize that what we're seeing is not necessarily generalizable to the rest of the person's life, are the two biggest issues with testing. I could go on further, but I'm going to stop here.
I know. And I would just like to add that I guess the most important thing for me is that in general, Black people do not test well on any of these tests. And by the mere fact that you're giving the Black person the test, 9 times out of 10, they're going to do poorly. Not because they don't have adaptive skills. They have adaptive skills that these tests don't measure, is the one issue. And then the other issue is there are differences between how Black and white people would score on these things. And I think the other thing that's important for me is that I don't get the sense that legal people really understand the issues with the test. They seem to take the test score as if it really means something, or, it really shows the person, can't parent, or it really should. And the reality is that's not what the test score shows. What it shows, A, is how close the person is to being similar to a white middle class sample, and then how close is my client? How is my client dealing with the stress of that environment on that particular day? Those are the two things that the test score is saying to me, as opposed to the attorneys and the judge sometimes, who think that it's like the answer to whatever they think their question is. And it's just usually not so.
Pull Aisha into our conversation and about her experience with the psychological and psychiatric. Aisha, did you have to go through this? I know the answer is yes. And you can also touch on bonding, which is its own session. But if you want to touch on your experience with testing, that would be great.
Okay, so I was looking at the slides and I seen that it said, so I have to put these blocks together to get my kids back. And it's true. Like they give you a piece of paper and they ask you silly questions, and they ask you things like, do you see things? And the wording, like I told my therapist, I see things everywhere. Do I see things that other people don't see? So is that what you're asking me? And, it's just like, you're clever. But, these tests, I don't really know what they're for. Like I took all of the tests that you could take, and it basically just showed that I was capable of being a parent. I don't really understand these exams, like the blocks. If a parent couldn't read or write, that doesn't mean they can't parent. So it's a little difficult for me on my side.
And do you recall, I know you and I've talked about it, like the actual physical experience of sitting in a room feeling like I have to pass this test to get my kids back? Like, what were you thinking? What was the pressure?
So I'm sitting there and I'm sitting there with my paperwork. I'm like, okay, what's the best answer that I can give? Because they have a point score. So I want to get the most points. So I think the most points means I'm a good parent. So I just want to, what would you do? I would do. What do you think I would do? I would just put any answer that I thought was right, and then it just made me seem like I was just picking answers because I didn't want to, seem like I didn't know what I was doing. So it was a little difficult.
And did you feel like your whole life depended on it? Was that like?
Definitely. Like if I didn't answer this right, I was not going to get my kids back. And and it was a lot of them. It was everywhere I went, every program that I went to. You got to do this first. They don't even talk to you. Hi, how you doing? Fill this paper out. And then they'll see who you are as a person. Because that paper first. I'm sorry again.
You finish, Aisha.
Oh, no, the paper first, I don't really know what they decide when they see that paper before they talk to you.
I just want to say that leaving aside parent attitude surveys, and I'll mention that in a minute, all the rest of the tests, the IQ test, the personality inventories, all of that, there's no clear relationship between any of that and parenting. All right. And in fact, when the test publishers and the test writers and all of that hear, for example, that personality inventories are being used to make decisions about whether parents should resume care of their children or not, they're appalled, or at least they say they're appalled. They say, that's not what I developed the test to do. Most of those personality inventories were developed for patients to help clinicians try to figure out how best to help a patient. Where are the areas that are problematic? Where are the areas that are not problematic? They're not related to parenting capacities. Now, there are tests that are about parenting attitudes, but I have to tell you, the one that's being used the most frequently in New Jersey is a test that has nothing in the manual about who the people are that it's been standardized on. So going back to the point that Dr. Johnson make about parentified children, what are called parentified children, and corporal punishment and all of that, it's based on a set of attitudes that the test writers have. And who knows, it's your guess as good as mine, who they've tested this out on. But there's no evidence in the manual that it was used on a Black population. So, we don't know really. We don't have good data on attitudes. I would say the best tests, at least the ones that seem to have the most data, have to do with how the parent feels their relationship with the child is. And I will tell you that very few people seem to be using those. So I find that fascinating in and of itself, is that they're not asking parents about their own relationship with their own child.
That paperwork or none of those questions had anything to do with parents. So that's right. I didn't understand that either.
And I think, Aisha, you are revealing what every client and what the parents you're working with now go through. It's and just as a advocate, we try to prepare our clients, and not in passing or understanding tests. Sometimes we do. We have social workers. Aisha has gone through it. More about having their anxiety reduced, stress, actually bringing materials to the evaluation so it's not one-sided. The other issue is these doctors only receive the agency file or the file that's being referred to them, so it's really one-sided. And to hear your input from the doctors, what it feels like when you get been accused at legal services, that now the client's trying to persuade or do fake good when they're bringing in that they completed these programs, or we do a certification, it's used against them, but we're only trying to rebut what's in the agency file. And that comes up, like, wouldn't this have been helpful to hear directly from the parent and what they understood their issues to be? Like I said, some doctors don't like it. Your thoughts on that, and how to some tips for attorneys on working on these issues with testing?
Well, one thought that I have is, when you're cross-examining an expert, ask them to tell you what the research says about how relatable that particular test score is to the issues before the court. And if they cannot produce that data, which I doubt that they will be able to, because there isn't much and there is none, then at least you would be able to discredit it on the stand at least.
Yeah, and I just want to say something about the bell curve that's now up there. And again, I could go on at some length about this, but I just want to make the point, 2 points. First of all, the whole notion that IQ is on a bell curve with most people in the middle and fewer people at either end, either being very smart or very limited, is an assumption that is the basis of the test, so that when answers come in from the standardization sample, if answers don't produce this bell-shaped curve, they rearrange things so that they can get that bell-shaped curve. And you need to ask why it's so important to have an upper end. When you think about taking a driving test, everybody has to drive at a certain level in order to pass the test. We don't care about the excellent drivers versus the average drivers. Everybody gets a license, and it doesn't say, oh, this was an excellent driver versus an average driver. But we have a need in our society for that tail at the top, as well as the one at the bottom. And I think it's important that we just understand that these tests, this test particularly, the IQ test, are really designed to predict who's going to be the next elite, and to maintain the elite as it exists. So that's general. Now, what it turns out, what's happened is that blacks on average score about 15 points lower than whites, and that difference is not, we don't have a different set of norms. So when black people are scoring average, they're scoring like 85 roughly on the test, and when white people are scoring average, they're scoring as 100. And so somebody who's somewhat below average in, let's say, the white group might be scoring 85. In the black group, they're going to be down to 70. Now, that's at the borderline of intellectual disability. And so all these questions start coming up. Well, are they too disabled intellectually to understand what they have to do for their children? Do they know when the kid is sick? Do you start generalizing from responses to questions that have nothing to do with everyday activities? They are very academically impacted either by, the scores are good predictors of academic achievement, but they're not predictors of life success and life adaptation. And anybody who relies on the IQ test, particularly these days, is out of step, because the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual now, the Bible of psychiatry, basically says that you cannot make a diagnosis of intellectual disability without functional incapacity. So you have to go back and actually look at functional capacity. Can the person handle money? Can the person sign a name to a document saying that they are leasing an apartment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Without, can they travel by bus? Without evidence of functional incapacity, the whole IQ thing is irrelevant.
These tests are very individualized. Like, it doesn't give you any room, as you described, Dr. E, of trying to inquire into that parent's life. As we were describing before, many of our parents are in communities and rely on their parents, and that's looked down upon. You have to independently thrive at a highest level possible. The standards that we see on media are what judges and attorneys for the agency or caseworkers understand and know. And so I never see that in testing. And if a parent identifies supports, that's looked at as a weakness. Looking for help is looked at, asking for help is a weakness for our families. Okay. So I do want to hit on some of the questions, but I'll keep going back, we may. Okay, so we went through treatment, we've gone through psychological testing. Here's where we're going to solve everything for, the last 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes is our hope, with interventions to support families. So I'll let the doctors go first.
So I'll just say a few things. In relation to recommendations in forensic reports, because Black people tend to be overdiagnosed and because it's cultural misunderstanding, that's going to lead to them getting more recommendations, like I said before, than they need or that are warranted. I guess the other thing that I would say is that because of cultural issues in testing, and because the tests don't measure something that's related to what the issues are before Child Protective Services, like we just said a few minutes ago, I think that we should move towards doing more of a functional evaluation in regards to, has the client functionally changed sufficiently for child safety, rather than just looking at them in terms of compliance alone, looking at them in terms of whether they've solved all their mental health issues, or looking at them in terms of a test score or a diagnosis alone. The other issue is that a lot of times we'll see in reports, doctors make recommendations for the client to get a job and to be able to get an apartment. Well, the reality is that that does not reflect an understanding that there are structural racism issues regarding why people just can't get work and why they can't find a job. And, you know, in my mind, those kinds of racism issues should never be the reason why someone doesn't get a child back. And then the last thing that I will just add, which we haven't really touched on, is that, you know, there are a lot of cross-racial foster care and adoption going on these days. And I just want to say that if that is happening, there really needs to be some specific planning around helping that Black child develop positive racial identity and positive racial socialization, because those things are critical for Black children to develop optimally. And it's going to require, okay, them having the ability to be around Black role models, not just now and then, but on a regular basis. So that if your expert is advocating for a Black child to be adopted by a white family, then part of the doctor's questioning should be, well, what is the white parent's plan for racial socialization and positive racial identity? And if they don't have a plan, then I'm going to say that that may not be the best home for that child.
That's incredibly helpful. I just wanted to just piggyback on that as an advocate. And I just want to hit on with psychological testing before I forget, because there's some questions in the chat and comments, is that all these testing is available to lawyers. You can actually get their manuals, you can get their data, you can request doctors' data, what they're supplying on, what they're measuring, and subpoena or request these things. I always do. So you know exactly that in the testing, and it's now pretty publicly available that you know that the samples are based on upper middle class white men, right? This is really significant. So I just wanted to note that if that wasn't cleared throughout our presentation, this is available, especially with the DSMs and the like, all of these things are available to you, and it's something that I would just recommend. And you can just, again, doctors are should be able to testify, or they can note who the sample is, and that it shows that it doesn't reflect the community that they're assessing or who we're serving. So just wanted to note that. And again, the functional question, I think it's, Aisha and I always joke about this, how our clients are expected to solve poverty and housing deficit for around the world in their individual case, right? You know, we have an eviction moratorium, but that means our clients have to try harder. You know, if they can't get food from the food pantry, that's their fault, because the welfare office can't distribute their food stamps. That's somehow they need to figure out food. It's been worse for our clients during COVID. They have expected to be superhuman powers during COVID, where there's benefits and relief to the upper middle class, right? Again, it doesn't get translated into this work by who we look to, right, to the medical field, to you both doctors, who I feel are honestly the few who understand this. What do you recommend for us to sort of communicate this to the medical field, either in court or out of court?
Well, I mean, the problem is that somebody put in the chat before, there needs to be much more training of people in the mental health field about what this issue is about. And unfortunately, there are still many graduate programs where the only person teaching about this is an adjunct teaching one course. It really needs to be integrated into all of the material, the evaluation material, the treatment material, and we're nowhere near that. I mean, that's the truth. And so I don't know that it's going to get corrected on the outside of the system, except if people are actually embarrassed when they're cross-examined about what they don't know. And I personally am not a big fan of embarrassment as a source of growth, but I think it might be necessary in the situation. I would just like to add a few other things about the treatment issues, if I can. I want to just say a couple of things. Usually when somebody writes a report evaluating, let's say, a kid, I'm going to talk about kids right now, and they're saying the kid needs, or parents too, and they're saying they need individual therapy, they need this type of therapy, they need a licensed provider. They omit the natural sources of help that many people turn to and rely on and trust. So, for example, the faith community, local resources that offer much more peer-to-peer kind of support tend to get minimized as significant. And the only things that are accepted are people with lots of degrees after their names. And I think this is a big problem because there are these problems in engagement between clients who come from poor Black backgrounds and upper middle class white clinicians. And so if you're saying they must see these people, even aside from all the problems of confidentiality, what's going to happen what's going to be involved in terms of a genuine engagement is going to be enormous. And we somehow miss that. And the same thing goes for when we arrange these mentoring things for children, 6 months of paid mentorship with somebody who has no natural connection to a child. So I think and I will just say one more thing about the treatment of children, is when they're sent for treatment of trauma, it invariably is about trauma that allegedly occurred in the parent's home and not as a result of the rupture of the relationship with the parent. And I've actually heard kids who have, quote, graduated from the child welfare system saying things about their own treatment that is right up this alley, which is saying, my therapist wanted me to talk about how I was traumatized when I was 8, but I want to talk about how I don't know what's happening, whether I didn't know how long I'd be in this place, whether I'd see my mother again, when I'd see my mother again. You can't even deal with that historical stuff if it has to be dealt with, as long as kids are feeling so impermanent, so disconnected, so alienated. So we're not looking at the trauma that we are creating. There may be prior trauma, but we're not, in our treatment, we are not looking, when we treat children, at the trauma that we as a system have created. And I think this is really terrible. This to me is, if I had to pick out one thing, we think we're providing support to the kids, but we're not.
I was a foster youth. I was a foster youth as well. And I didn't feel like I can trust anybody. Nobody listened to me. They didn't ask me, do I feel comfortable in this home? Like I just was always with strangers, and it's not a good feeling. And they offered therapy when I was younger, I guess, because I started to age out. And there were only like a couple of programs left for children my age. So I was in like a therapeutic, like Tri-City. You guys know Tri-City, right? So yeah, they offered therapy, but I was never, even as a child, honest with my therapist. Like you just don't trust anybody. So even if you can get a kid to, to talk, like what are they going to tell you? I've been through so many things in different foster homes that I couldn't even share, and I was never properly helped. Mm-hmm. So, it's a little bit harder because as a child, you're guarded, especially when you're coming in, like you're just meeting new people every day. These people are just asking you questions, and then they control your life. They control your life. That's what she said.
Thank you. And I know, Aisha's been through it as a youth, and then and saw what her mom went through. And her mom was also in the foster care system. So talk about creating a fake system, right? I just wanted to point out, and we have a few minutes, and the comments about trauma and what we're artificially creating. And that includes what happens to the parent and child through the system. So for example, if a parent becomes depressed after her child is removed or relapses or decides not to go to visitation, no one thinks about how the system is doing this to the parent. It's like, aren't you not fighting hard enough? Like, why would you not go to a visit? Not thinking that every time they go to the visit, they feel like it's another removal, and it destroys them over and over again. And that's faulted at them. And I know Aisha and I talk about that all the time, or when you start to go to the visits and the child starts talking about their foster parent, and that's devastating. How do they handle that? Or the child acts out when they go home after seeing the parent, and how that's misinterpreted by the court as the parents failing and agitating the child at the visit. I mean, these are so artificial things that are created by this child regulation system. And it's unfortunately, as we see it, and I can, as I say, these doctors excluded, supported by the medical specialists that are pulled into the system to make recommendations. And so as a parent advocate, I think we are in an unusual, incredible place to speak this plainly. Sadly, Black men and women and children have had to be murdered in the last few years. There's been separations at the border where we can actually talk about this instructional racism, racist practice and bias in our systems. And I just want to highlight that these are places that you have to connect these points together. We must show that visitation is connected to the biases and racism that we promulgate on every level. As a parent's attorney, as a judge, as a social worker, if we're not talking about this plainly, there's really not going to be any change. And, you know, to protect the future Aisha's and her children, I know that's why Aisha is here and committed to doing this. We just have 5 minutes. I want to make sure I hit on all the questions, but any last comments that we would like to make? Dr. John?
No, I'm good.
Dr. Esklin, I know you always.
Yeah, I just want to underscore what you just said about kind of misinterpreting behaviors that children exhibit, because the other thing that happens that often results in fewer contacts is that not just the parent is upset, but the child is upset, right? And what is interpreted often for that is that the child is reenacting or is experiencing a reenactment of the original trauma. They're being reminded of the original trauma, of course, is the alleged abuse or neglect by the parent. So then they say, well, the child is not ready to see the parent regularly because they have not worked through that original trauma. When for almost all of the cases, if you had more regular visits, more contact, phone and what have you, you'd probably have less behavioral disturbance, not more on because for a young child, a week apart is forever. That's forever. So each visit, when they leave the parent, from their perspective, they don't know when they're going to see the parent again. Next week is like saying next year to an adult. And I think that really is a huge issue, that we don't have frequent enough and non-structured enough contact, you know, and that goes to the whole issue of resource parents and what they do or don't do, or what they're taught to do or not taught to do in terms of their relationship with that parent.
Thank you. Yes, you will have the slides, and all of these are several questions, and the sources are in the slides. Our information's available. Feel free to reach out. A question from Alaska, and this is going back to our earlier point about when you have a private attorney and releases. I have narrowed releases often, just to make that point. That's absolutely, and doctors, this is my conversation, Dr. Johnson, Dr. E might know I do this. When I talked to a doctor, I said, they're kind of looking, if you are a treating doctor and you're not calling the division on your patient because you don't feel like there's a safety concern, I just highlight that to a doctor, because if you release all the records, and like 5 years ago, one of our clients said, I want to jump in front of a train, you didn't call the division, and because you actually knew it was not a safety concern, I just point that out. I give that as an example. I say, well, doctor, don't you just want to limit what you're revealing because you're treating that patient? And doctors are like, oh yeah, you're right. I shouldn't be signing a blanket release. And I have to say, the doctors who have been committed to their patients do have that sense, that worry. They don't want to be on the hook, one, right? And two, they're actually committed to serving their patient and are irritated by the agency trying to come in and control their patient relationship. So those are incredible doctors. The doctors who are unfortunately not that way, like I said, you know, keep in mind, this is going to be examined, you know, and they become defensive, but it actually has been helpful. And I just want to note that. We have 2 more minutes. I think that was it.
Can I just say one other thing? I think that the general practitioner, mental health practitioner, views this system as a court. As they view any interaction from the court, from CPS, as a court order. And I think you guys ought to be aware of that, because they think that they have to respond completely to whatever CPS wants. I keep getting questions from my colleagues. I get calls all the time from my colleagues about exactly this issue.
Absolutely. And that's a great, working with Dr. Eskelin all these years. Yes, you can narrow, you can bring in, I talk to the agency doctor. I talk about who the relationship is. I mean, I might be hung up on or they don't return my calls, but I'm pursuing this because that's the rest of the world. This is not a separate world. Going back to Dorothy Roberts and Marty Guggenheim, there has to be real change, and this is a place to challenge. And I just want to thank my panelists for sharing this time with us and taking time out of their incredibly busy schedule. And I really appreciate this audience, and a special thanks and love to my good soulmate, Aisha, who does incredible work on sharing her story and always being vulnerable. I know it's not easy, and she's always willing to do it. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, everybody.
So long.